We keep finding new and interesting people to bring in, including today. Annie Murphy-Paul is our guest, and Lee Holtz, as always, will do the formal introduction, but I'll just say, Annie, thank you very much for coming. She's terrific, and we were just talking about the fact that Annie just seems to be everywhere these days. If she's not blogging at Time or writing a new book, she's on the op-ed page of the op-ed section of the Times yesterday. She's everywhere, which is really what we should all aspire to be doing. We have the pleasure of welcoming Annie, and so with that, I'll turn it over to Robert Lee Holtz, Distinguished Writer in Residence here at the Carter Institute, and a science writer for the Wall Street Journal. It's all yours, Professor Holtz.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. And Annie Murphy-Paul, welcome.
Thank you.
To Inside Out, and welcome to all of you. Science journalism in the 21st century, what a curious thing. What a moving target. So there are some people who have really pioneered a new form of science journalism, takes advantage of the possibilities and the challenges of new media and the rapidly reconfiguring publishing business and the amazing collapsing, imploding, exploding newspaper business and the online world to kind of transform what we used to think of, I think, as a traditional kind of detached observational science journalist model into really a kind of new breed of public intellectual. Someone who can make themselves the voice of authority for a special area of expertise. And in Annie's case, she is a pioneer in this, juggling blogs, public speaking, Twitter feeds, essays, book reviews, and books that have put her at the center of a national conversation about how we learn and how we develop. She is, by necessity, perhaps, pioneering this new form. Journalist is juggler. Her brand, Annie Murphy-Paul, helps people understand how we learn and how we can do it better. So that's the commercial. She is a book author, magazine journalist, a consultant, and a speaker. She writes for Time magazine as a columnist about learning, time.com, blog. She blogs about learning at Forbes.com, still, yeah, and Mindshift.com. It's 3 blogs. She contributes to the New York Times Magazine, New York Times Book Review, Oprah's magazine, and a great many other publications. She's written 2 well-regarded books. First, she's the author of a book entitled The Cult of Personality, which was a cultural history and scientific critique of personality testing, and more recently, of Origins. A book about the science of prenatal influences. And Origins, I should note, was one of the New York Times' 100 notable books of 2010. Now she's now at work at on a book about the science of learning, and that's one of the things that we want to talk about this evening, this process. The book is tentatively titled How to Be Brilliant, The New Science of Smart. And I guess it's scheduled to be published by Crown in 2013. She is, in essence, drafting this new book in public through her blogs. She's a very brilliant speaker. The online video of her TED Talk last July, What We Learn Before We're Born, has been viewed, as of this afternoon, 500,062 and 697 views. And that actually adds up to about more than 1 million people have watched this so far. She tweets, as I mentioned, so she's attracted 10,214 followers. She follows, more interesting to me, she follows 9,000 people. And in her copious free time has generated more than 6,700 tweets.
Wow.
She's relaunching her website, AnnieMurphyPaul.com, next month. Some of what we'd like to talk about is the mechanics of that. But Origins. In the spirit of Origins, let's talk for a minute about your own beginnings. How did you get into this? You were minding your own business and studying American studies. I mean, this is not what we think of as a traditional path into a technical field?
Yes, so first of all, thank you all for having me come in today and talk to you, and I really want to hear from all of you and what your questions are. But to the question of origins, as Lee said, I started out in college. I thought I would be an English major. I ended up being, I was at Yale. I ended up being an American Studies major, which is an interdisciplinary major, and a lot of colleges and universities have a similar kind of program where you take from history, a little bit from history, a little bit from cultural studies, a little bit from literature, and that ended up actually being a very good preparation for being a journalist, because that's what journalists do. You know, we are like magpies looking for the shiny new thing, and putting that in the context of old things and trying to say something new that people haven't heard before. So that was my college education, and I knew right out of college that I wanted to be a writer, mostly because I didn't think I could do anything else. Like, writing was my one talent. So my first job was at my university's alumni magazine, the Yale Alumni Magazine, which I mostly did because I had a boyfriend in law school at Yale Law School at the time, so I could stick around New Haven. But it turned out to be a really great first job, in part because I had an editor named Carter Wiseman, who was a longtime Newsweek editor and then had kind of semi-retired to be the editor of the Alumni Magazine. And he was really a mentor, and the kind of mentor that I would encourage you all to seek out if you haven't found someone like this yet. Carter really walked me through how you construct an article, which I think is still the most important skill that journalists can have in some way. I mean, perhaps I'm slighting reporting and all the other important things that journalists do, but I work now as an editor on a volunteer basis for a organization called the Op-Ed Project, which helps women and minorities publish op-eds and other articles in national publications. And so I work with a lot of aspiring writers, would-be writers, and the one thing that I find that that is missing is an ability to structure the architecture of their pieces in a way that establishes for the reader where you're starting out, where you're going, leads them step by step to an end that makes sense and wraps it all up. So, and that was very much what I learned from my first editor, Carter. He advised me, and I have taught writing in addition to serving as this kind of freelance editor, volunteer editor. And one thing I've recommended to my students many, many times is a technique that Carter taught me, which is what he called reverse engineering an article. So you take an article that you admire, maybe one by John McPhee or Rachel Carson. I'm sure you guys have been reading lots of good stuff in your classes. And you take it apart and literally outline as if you were going backward. Usually we outline and then write a full piece from there, but this would be like writing an outline of what someone has already written. And just see how they put the pieces together, how they establish their initial premise, get the reader interested, draw them through their own thinking process or reporting and exploration process to bring the reader to some new place where they didn't start out. And that's an enormously helpful, it's been an enormously helpful technique for me. And I still kind of, when I read a great article in the New Yorker, I'm thinking, how did this writer do this? How did they put this together? So do you
diagram stories? I mean, do you draw pictures?
When I started out, I did for sure. Yeah, Carter was very much almost like a teacher in that he had me do things. He made me do things, and this was my job. So I literally had to diagram some articles that he handed me, and that was how I learned how a story gets put together.
Okay, so this is a good apprenticeship you're getting at your first job.
It was very much an apprenticeship.
You didn't have to mix glue and things, but you did learn, the mechanics. But
yeah.
What really, I think, got you sparked about this, though, was actually interviewing people, like sort of having the conversations with that cross section of professors. I mean, who taught you to talk? Who taught you to inquire? Or did anyone?
Well, I think I think the curiosity and the desire to ask questions, if you don't start out with that, then I would wonder why you'd want to be a journalist. But I think that's usually a pretty irrepressible aspect of people who go into, characteristic of people who go into journalism. But as Lee mentions, in that first job, my task was really to interview all these Yale professors and researchers and scientists to share with Yale alumni what was going on at Yale in the research domain. And so I just got to talk to incredibly interesting people doing all this fascinating work. It was almost like, whenever you go to college, you kind of don't get to take half of the classes that you really wish that you could because you don't have time or they're not in your major. And I actually got to talk to all the people that I wish I'd taken classes with, and got to ask them all the questions that you don't always get to ask of your professors. So I did that for 2 years, and I think that was very much my postgraduate education, and it was a very kind of safe space to try that out because I had this editor who very much saw me as a protege and saved me from a lot of mistakes, I'm sure.
So you did that for 2 years?
2 years.
And then you came to New York?
Then I came to New York, yeah.
And what?
I as much as I wanted to stay in New Haven to be with this boyfriend, I also knew that New York was the place to be. So after 2 years, I headed to New York and got a job at Psychology Today magazine, which I got through a classified ad. I'm sure no one ever gets jobs like that way anymore. But they were advertising for an assistant editor. I think it was assistant editor, which is a bit of a misleading title because it really meant their job description should have said must write half of magazine every month because it was really run on a shoestring. And in some ways, very poorly run, but I would advise anyone starting out in journalism to look for a job like this because you just get an incredible crash course in writing and you get to see your name and your words in print every month. I had a couple other options of jobs that I could have taken in New York, and one of them was was an editorial assistant at a fancy magazine, at Condé Nast magazine. And I didn't take that editorial assistant job. I remember asking the person who interviewed me, well, will I ever get a chance to do any writing? And she laughed and she said, we have, so-and-so and so-and-so. And she kind of like listed all the famous writers who wrote for them. Why would you ever write for us? And it was very clear that even though it would be very nice to have this fancy magazine on my resume, that I wasn't, at least in the foreseeable future, going to do much beyond, fact-checking, or not that fact-checking can be very, a very educational experience also, but that I was not going to be able to be writing on a regular basis. And I wanted to stretch those muscles and practice those skills as much as I could.
So you voted for the possibilities of chaos.
Yes, and I definitely got chaos. There was, so I remember but there's also great friendships that can be forged in that kind of situation also, and I still am friends with a lot of those Psychology Today people. And I remember one of them comparing the conditions under which we worked to writing for a magazine in like a former Soviet Union country because there was like one computer that was always broken, like one computer that was connected to the internet. I mean, this was back in the mid-90s, but only one computer that was connected to the internet, like, a copier that was always broken, crazy kind of managerial shenanigans going on all the time. But if you just kind of kept your head down and kept doing your work, I got a pile of clips.
I'll just add that not much has changed at Psychology Today.
I'm sure that's right.
The magazine is still a lot like that. It's still a place that is very chaotic, but also a place where you can get a lot of clips.
And another thing I learned there was that when you are at a place that's understaffed and on a shoestring, if you raise your hand and say, I'll do that, you can get a lot of opportunities I wrote, within 6 months, I was hired to be, news editor, that's what I was. I was hired to be the news editor. So to edit and occasionally write little bite-sized things in the front of the magazine. But one day, like a feature story fell through, and it was another moment of chaos. Like, what are we going to do? We don't have we have this big hole, and I said, well, I'll write it, and so I wrote something in a few days, and it ended up being a cover story, and it was kind of like, oh, like, okay. I mean, if you put yourself, if you're willing to kind of do some extra work and put yourself on the line, then you can get opportunities to do things. And I think that's even more true now because
What do you mean?
well, every news organization is underfunded now. I don't know that even the Condé Nast magazines have the squadrons of fact-checkers and editorial assistants that they once did. There's just not that much, there's not as many layers as there used to be. So I think, and certainly you can even write something and put it on the Huffington Post, and like if it's interesting and catchy enough, it may get millions of viewers even without the imprimatur of like a fancy magazine.
So you have these interesting staff experiences,
Yes.
but if I understand correctly, you really had it in your head to do the one thing that most people who have staff positions don't want to do,
Yeah.
which is become a freelancer, because then you give up like all that great stability and health insurance and free coffee and creative
Well,
chaos for your
yes.
own loneliness and fraught experiences. But,
Yeah.
So tell us about that.
Well, I should say that Lee may have one of the last, good staff writing jobs in America. There are not that many staff writing jobs at places where you'd want to work, if there ever were. I mean, there's a lot of editorial positions, but I guess at that point I made the assessment that if I wanted to write a variety of articles, if I wanted to write about what I wanted to write about, I was going to need to be a freelancer. And I think even then the ultimate goal was like, well, maybe I'll be a staff writer later on the basis of what I'm writing now, the variety of publications that I'm generating now. I think maybe that was a goal. It's not anymore for me. I don't live in New York anymore, for one thing. But freelancing looked like the greatest target of opportunity for me, I guess. So I started freelancing while I was still at Psychology Today, and I was telling Leah this when we talked before on the phone, that we were not allowed, I mean, it wasn't stated that we weren't allowed to write for other publications, but we certainly weren't supposed to be reporting and working on these articles while we were in the office. And yet I worked there from 9 to 5 days a week, so when was I supposed to, do reporting? You can hardly, especially if it's someone very prominent, or you can't say, well, I have, half an hour in the morning, or I can you call me on Saturday? It's really that is tough. So I did a lot of my interviews in the broom closet at Psychology Today, and literally in the broom closet, yeah. And I would just kind of disappear as if for a coffee break or something, and do my interview. And I used to, at that point I taped my interviews. Maybe we want to talk about the mechanics of that. I don't generally tape them anymore, just because transcribing is so incredibly time consuming, and I've perfected a shorthand that I can get down almost every word of what someone's saying if I am taking notes. I know people who can do that typing, but I've never been able to do that. That's super efficient, because I still have to type up my notes, but if you can learn to type really fast while talking, then that's a great skill to have. But back then I did tape all my interviews, and I didn't have very sophisticated equipment to do it on, especially when I was in the broom closet. So I used to buy these tape recording devices from Radio Shack that was like a little suction cup, and you would stick it to the back of the phone and then stick the other end in your little portable kind of Walkman-like. I mean, this is a
Yeah.
long time ago.
And then you have to become very expert in wiretapping laws
Yes,
of various
yes,
states.
yes,
Like, well,
yes.
you know, am I
Right.
engaging
Well, I
in a
would-
criminal conspiracy
would-
if I call someone in Nevada and forget to tell them I'm taping them?
Yes,
I mean,
there are
it's
laws in
it's very
some state that
complicated.
say that the other person has to consent to being
Yeah.
taped. So I would start out my conversation
Uh-huh.
by saying, I'm taping this conversation so I can get your words. I would tell them why I'm taping it, and that was usually never a problem. But what was the problem was the suction cup kept popping off all the time. So it was not easy, but those articles that I wrote while I was at Psychology Today eventually helped me get my next job, which was as health editor of More magazine. And I took that job because it paid as much as my Psychology Today position, but was part-time. It was 3 days a week. And I eventually negotiated that down to 2 days a week. And that gave me 3 days at home to report and do whatever I needed to do on my other pieces. So it was like one stepping stone to the next to move towards being full-time freelance,
And are you
which
having
was
to
my
sort
goal.
of, you talk about negotiating from 3 days down to 2 days.
Mhm.
It's rare that we're in a position of trying to negotiate to do less work, you know, I mean, but did you have to deal with, you know, non-compete agreements and intellectual property
Interesting.
clauses and things?
Yeah.
I mean,
No,
No?
no. And in fact, I was an editor and not a writer for More. I don't think I
okay.
wrote anything for More. But I wrote about women's health and things that were very much in the More bailiwick, but I don't think that
Mhm,
they
mhm.
didn't see that as a
and
as
had
a
you
problem.
focused sort of on a coverage area at this point that you were particularly interested in, or are you just taking assignments as you can find them?
No, the characteristic that always defined my articles, and I've almost never written an article that wasn't like this, was that I was the meat of my article came from talking to researchers of some kind, academic researchers
Mhm.
and scientists. So the topics were sometimes pretty diverse, but I was never the kind of writer who could go up to somebody on the street and say, you know, how do you think Mayor Bloomberg is doing? Or, you know, I just, that wasn't.
Do you
First
feel a
of-
sense of loss? I mean, I'm just,
No, I feel like I got away with something. I feel like because when I went to Columbia Journalism School, there was which I did as a mid-career student, and I was supposed to take their basic class, like reading and writing, or reporting and writing 101 or something like that. It's a famous class, I forget what the name of it is. And it required you to go out and like go to different neighborhoods in New York and like stop people on the street. And I managed to wiggle out of that requirement and not do it. And I should have learned to do that, but it's just not the kind of writer I am, and I feel lucky that I was able to get into that groove early on and follow it and dig very deep into it rather
Mhm.
than, you know, being a generalist or trying different methods of reporting works for some people, but I love the fact that scientists are usually really happy to talk to you. I mean, chasing down people who don't want to talk to you just seemed really unpleasant to me. So scientists are often really happy to talk to you as a journalist and to get the word out about their research, as long as they feel that you're going to do a responsible job of conveying it. They're very easy to reach because their email addresses are listed on faculty web pages. It's very easy to go into a conversation with a scientist prepared with good questions because their work is already out there and you can know a lot about them and what they do and what their views are just before ever talking to them. But if you do, and in fact, you'll have a much better conversation, obviously, if you have educated yourself in advance, not only about their work, but about work that may diverge from theirs, what the kind of debate within their part of the scientific community is. So all those things, to me, made for a really an experience of reporting and writing where I loved every step of it.
So you're working as an editor at More. You're kind of doing this as last step before jumping completely into the
Right.
moral vacuum of freelancing.
Well,
and,
I wanted to write books. That was
well,
the
that's
other thing
what I
too.
wanna-
Yeah,
that's what I
yeah.
wanna
I
get
now
to.
remember why I wanted to be a
Okay,
realtor.
yeah. So you actually had something in mind here, which
Yeah.
is that you wanted to write books. Lord help you.
Mm-hmm.
And your first book was about personality testing.
Right.
Tell us how that came to be. It strikes me as that's a very classic sort of traditional,
Mm-hmm.
focused, proposal-driven project.
Yes.
But I don't know how you came to it.
Yes. Actually, it was even very much modeled on a classic work of science journalism or science writing, which is The Mismeasure of Man by Stephen Jay Gould. And I was reading that just as a kind of self-education in science writing classics, because I hadn't really set out to be a science writer, but for all the reasons that I was just mentioning, I found that writing about science was very rewarding and very appealing. But I didn't have a background in science writing and didn't know very much of the sort of classic work. So I was, in a kind of nerdy way, like, educating myself and reading The Mismeasure of Man. And I remember thinking, I wonder if anyone has done for personality tests what Stephen Jay Gould has done for IQ tests in this volume. And I was sort of inclined to think in that direction because I've been writing about psychology at Psychology Today. Psychology, psychiatry, mental health had become something of my specialty coming out of Psychology Today. And I'd encountered personality testing as something people did for fun and self-discovery, and also something that was used a lot in the workplace. And I was always kind of, I actually had never taken one myself, but I was intrigued and a little bit skeptical of the idea that science could measure, could kind of quantify human nature, which is how I saw the project of many personality tests. So yeah, that it did follow a very conventional path in that I had that idea, I wrote a proposal, I got a book deal for a relatively small amount of money, and then I spent 18 months writing exactly what I had planned to write in my proposal. And so it all went kind of the way it was supposed to.
And when you're writing 18 months, because this is going to,
Yeah.
I think, relate to what we're going to talk
Yeah.
about in a minute. So you're off in a corner, you're in your garret, you've taken the phone off the hook, what's your methodology here?
For writing the book.
For this book, yeah.
I called it, I thought of it as going into my writing cave, which was meant for me that I did not write, during those 18 months, I did not write anything else. I viewed writing this book as my entire profession, it was the sum of my professional life for those 18 months. And actually it was one of probably one of the most enjoyable periods of my writing life, because I just delved so deeply into the archival research, and I did a fair amount of interviewing of contemporary personality, psychology of personality researchers, but a lot of it was cultural history of personality testing, and I spent days and days and days in the library, and I loved it. I loved it, and the writing came pretty easily.
18 months is fast.
Yeah, but I was a month late, and I was terrified that my contract would be canceled, and and not knowing, I guess, at the time that getting your book in on time is actually a pretty rare occurrence.
Unheard of.
Yeah. But because I was a month late, I was convinced it was all gonna.
But you wrote this in isolation.
Totally.
You did not try, if I'm reading this correctly, you did not try to sort of capitalize on the work you were doing for the book by spinning off a magazine story or going to Psychology Today or one of these many freelance places that you've cultivated carefully in the prior 4 years.
No.
Is that because personality testing is a topic that does not lend itself to
That's right.
breakfast time reading or?
It was both because I was so anxious about whether I could write this book at all. I mean, as I said, the actual writing of it was really enjoyable, but I was scared the whole time that could I write a book? I don't know. I never had. So I certainly wasn't going to, dissipate my energies by doing other things. I was so maniacally focused on making this happen. And I had chosen a topic that really didn't lend itself to multiple sort of entry points in terms of writing about it for magazines or periodicals, which was something I was not even on my horizon at that point. All I wanted to do was write a good book. I wasn't thinking then. I think I had what I think of now as the older mindset that it's the publisher's job and the publisher's publicity department. It's their job to get the book out. It's my job to write a good book, which it is our job to write a good book, but our job is to do so many more things than that now. And but that was not clear to me at that point, and I think it was actually not, the new model for writing books had not yet emerged really at that point.
Right, I don't think the publishing industry knew either.
No,
so, yeah.
no.
So you wrote this very nice, well-regarded, well-reviewed book. What happened?
It actually got a lot of media attention, and it was probably one of the high points of my life was going up to Malcolm Gladwell after a talk he gave, and I said, timidly, I sent you a galley of my book. It's coming out next week. Did you get a chance to read it? And he said, oh, Annie Murphy Paul, yeah, I wrote a piece about your book. It's coming out next week. And it was, Malcolm Gladwell had written an article about personality testing it was kind of based on my book. And, that was enough for me. That justified writing the book. But
and he credited your book.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Which can be not necessarily the case.
Right.
Oh, what a good idea. Can I borrow it? I'll give it back when I'm done.
Well, yeah, there was some of that, but as long as he said my name in the title of the book, I didn't care what he said. But the book didn't sell very well, and it certainly wasn't a going enterprise in the sense of making a living off making books, making a living off of writing books, if this was how it was going to go. So I conceived of kind of a bigger, I didn't mean to make that pun, but of a kind of bigger book the next time, and that in a way that went horribly wrong. But maybe should we?
Well, no, let's you bring it up.
Yeah.
So what you learned, among other things,
Yeah.
From writing your first book was that you couldn't afford to write a book. Am I hearing that right?
Certainly not the way that I was going about it. And I think the other thing I learned was that media attention and positive reviews doesn't ensure book sales, which
so there's a difference between what people...
Sounds obvious, but
well,
I didn't
not necessarily.
realize that. Yeah.
So there's a difference perhaps between what people might actually like to read and what in the public sphere we value as sort of an intellectual literary accomplishment.
Yes, and in addition to that, I changed agents after my first book, and I interviewed a bunch of different agents, which I recommend if you ever get a chance to talk to a few different agents before choosing one, because it was a really eye-opening experience just to get agents are really often really smart people who have seen the industry from their perspective, which is different from editors and writers' perspectives. They've been watching the publishing industry for a long time, and you can get a lot of insights from people like that. And I remember one agent who I didn't end up going with, but she said, you wrote a book that was perfectly aimed at a journalist who want a good story, but not for readers who want to read a book. And to that point, and I'm embarrassed to say this, I had never really thought about, does the reader, I wanted to create a good experience for the writer, for the reader, but I hadn't been thinking about what do people want to read about. I had been thinking, what would make a good story? What do I want to write about? And those are all important questions, but if you want to be commercially successful, I think you have to ask the question, what do people want to read about? And that really had not occurred to me.
So when you sat down to then think of, well, first of all, this experience did not put you off writing books forever.
No, I just wanted to do it better.
Uh-huh. So you dissected the process a little bit.
Very much so, and I wanted to write a book that would appeal to more people. You know, one other thing that I learned from the Cult of Personality was that it was really a work of social criticism, in part, cultural criticism, because I was telling the story of how personality tests came to be, but I was also critiquing them from a scientific point of view, and I was pretty harsh in my judgment, backed up, I believe, by the science. But it turns out that most people who are interested in personality tests are interested in them because they like them and they use them, and often they sell them or they're invested in some way, personally or professionally. So the only people who were really invested in my book were people who were just going to hate it because I came out against personality tests. So, and that had not occurred to me at all. That you need to think about who the audience is for your book and where they're coming from in terms of your topic. Not that you need to pander or anything like that, but in terms of selling books, there just wasn't a very big audience for people who were, how many people have really been hurt by personality tests? Maybe not that many. So how many people are interested in intellectual and cultural history? I hope a lot, but maybe fewer than we would like. So I sat down when I thought about what I wanted to write about next. I wanted it to be not so much, I guess I wanted to move away from being a critic and towards being someone who could offer solutions or someone who could offer new ideas that could change how people think about things in a positive way. I don't know if that makes
Well, no,
sense.
let's linger here for a sec.
Yeah.
So I think it's a classic dilemma that people trained as traditional journalists often have when they come to different kinds of storytelling forms. I mean, newspapers do one thing, they do one thing really, really well. Magazines do one thing, they do one thing really, really well. We're still trying to figure out what blogs and whatever are doing, and you're actually teaching us some of that. But when we come to books, often, our training as journalists is to identify a problem, grab it by the scruff of the neck, wrestle it to the ground, and strangle it,
Right.
which is a great public service,
Right.
but may not be something you want to curl up with in the bathtub on a Saturday afternoon.
Exactly. That's exactly.
But
it.
are these incompatible, or is it just simply you just need to think about telling that story differently?
That may be, and we can all think of books that that do that and find lots of readers. A Civil Action is the one I'm thinking of. Books that call attention to a problem but tell a fantastically interesting story along the way. I mean, I think Dan's book is probably going to be a lot like that.
Indeed.
But that's not so much the kind of story that I told in the first book. And to be honest, I was tired of pissing people off. That's what I had done with my first book. I wanted to write a book that had a different orientation to the reader, that people wanted to read. That people wanted to read in the interest of maybe making their own lives better. And I don't want to sound like I'm morphing into a self-help writer or anything like that. I just the mantle of social critic didn't sit very comfortably with me. I didn't want to play that role, and I've found that out through writing that first book. So and I expect I'm working on my third book now. I'd like to continue to write books, and I think what my role is as book author will continue to evolve.
So you came to your second book, Origins, a copy of which sits before us.
Yeah.
You were looking for, a big idea that people would like. Did you have a natural interest? Did this coincide with your own personal life? I mean, because obviously the writing of this book, for those of you who don't know, is as a narrative structured around your pregnancy.
Yes.
Both as a kind of narrative, but literally as a chapter structure.
Yes. Yeah.
So how did we get to that? Not did we get to pregnancy, I think we know that, but how did you get to this as the kind of topic
Yeah.
of this book, and how did you decide to write it this way, and what did you learn from that?
Yeah. Well, the thing about this book is what Origins eventually became was nothing like what I originally proposed. And this happens more often than you would think. I have a lot of friends who are writers, and I have a writers group that I founded and still come to every month in New York even now that I live in Connecticut. And you'd be surprised how many books take a very long and winding path from proposal to final book, and sometimes don't look very much like what was originally proposed. And I think one of the reasons for that is that a proposal is almost necessarily kind of a work of fiction, because you don't know what you're going to say. If the book's any good, you don't know what you're going to say until you go out and find it. And yet, to get the funds and the promise of eventual publication, you have to tell an editor and a publishing house, here's what I'm going to write about. And with my first book, with some books, I think you can be very straightforward and say, this is what I'm going to write about. I've done enough work, and I think it's important to do a lot of work for a proposal. I've done enough work to know what's out there. Here's how I'm going to develop it. Here's what the final product will look like. But with a lot of books, and a lot of the best books, I think it's a much more winding path to finding the structure, and even sometimes the angle, or even exactly what body of information you're going to be conveying. So that's what happened with this.
So you had how many years did you work on this?
4 years.
4 years. So compared to the 18 months of your first book, you had a long, torturous, winding, intellectual, emotional journey with this.
It felt incredibly, endlessly long while I was doing it. Now I think 4 years, I had 2 babies in that time. Maybe I should have been a little easier on myself, but it was supposed to take 2 years. So I was 2 years late. It was supposed to take 2 years. So it was 2 years late. And as I said, with my first book, I was terrified, panicked that I was a month late. So this was like, there were times when I thought, I'm going to give back the advance. I can't write this book. There were times when I thought maybe it would never happen. And maybe I'm just saying this to make myself feel better, but I've often heard writers say that the second book is very difficult, sophomore slump kind of thing. And I don't know if that's just people who had a very successful first book, and then they're trying to match that with the second book, but this one was very difficult for me.
And unlike the first book and this one, I'm looking at a 2008 New York Times Magazine piece, all 5,267 words, that appear to be related to your research. So you're trying now to spin off articles, to spin off this material while you're working on it for the book project.
Yes.
Am I wrong to think that?
No, you're right. And by this time, the idea of authors building a platform and building a brand and all these words that still make me recoil a little bit, but I think which we're going to probably have to become more comfortable with, that was more in the air. And I should just say, my original proposal for this book that became Origins, I was pregnant with my first son, and I was thinking about, in my personal life, I was thinking a lot about what do we hand on to our children? What's our kind of emotional inheritance that we pass on to our children? That was actually the original title. And there's things that we want to hand on to our children, and things that we really, characteristics or behaviors in our families that we really don't want to. And I wanted to write about how that happens, what the mechanisms are, what science knows about what's called intergenerational transmission. But I just really quickly became lost in a swamp of, nature, nurture. It was just a really hard thing to write about in a concise way. And I didn't have a handle or like an angle that could let me get into it in a clean way. So in doing this research, which quickly threatened to, just last forever, this research, because one thing led to another, and I was not focused in where I was looking, but in these different areas that I was examining in terms of how intergenerational transmission happens, the one area that jumped out at me as really not just interesting, because it was all interesting to me, that was the problem, but fresh and new and original and stuff I hadn't heard about before, was prenatal influences. That family characteristics could be actually passed down in the 9 months before birth. And this was something that I didn't think I hadn't seen written about before, and that I realized was actually this very dynamic and exciting area of scientific inquiry that hadn't really made the leap to public awareness. And once I thought, well, it was almost like grabbing for a life raft or something, because this was, I didn't know if my editor would go for this, because this was quite different from what I had originally proposed. He didn't know that I was going to be writing about pregnancy. But it was the only path I could see to writing something, to finding a kind of contained story. And then when I realized that I could structure it around the 9 months of my own pregnancy, which I did when I was having my second son, then that took care of the structure in a very neat way. So, and in the end, it kind of worked. I mean, I'm happy with how it turned out. And Lee was saying very kindly that you wouldn't think when you read it that it was, there was this backstory of Sturm und Drang and wandering around and not knowing where I was going. But this was not the book that I originally proposed, and I had to find my way there.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, now this, the magazine piece that I'm referring to.
Yes.
The first ache. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. I beg your pardon.
Very quick
Go ahead,
question.
please.
Hi. I'm wondering, hearing your, the journey that you've taken to the type of writing that you're doing now, especially since you started off as like a American cultural studies person, if you felt pigeonholed once you started at Psychology Today, given that you probably started at Psychology Today for reasons other than maybe an interest in psychology. Maybe it was there a little bit because it's a very interesting topic, but maybe when starting there, did you feel like you had a choice moving on to write about other topics, or did you just feel like, well, this is my marketability. This is how I can market myself to people that I have this interest or that I have this experience writing about psychology?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, first of all, I actually was quite interested in writing about psychology, and I found that you could kind of work that in different ways. I ended up writing about women's health and psychiatry and psychology and mental health, and there was such a variety of topics that I certainly never got bored. And in terms of being pigeonholed, actually having a beat or having a specialty is enormously helpful. If you kind of have written about a whole bunch of different things, it's much harder, I find, to get an editor to say, okay, I'll take a risk on this writer that I've never used before. But if you have a number of clips from a number of different publications, all in the same general area, you've started to establish yourself as someone who really knows that area. And actually, you really do. I mean, it's not just kind of an appearance of expertise. If you've been in an area for a while, you actually do kind of know what you're talking about in a way that if you were just jumping into some field that you had no clue about, it's very easy to get things wrong and to find yourself floundering around. So actually, very, very apart from feeling pigeonholed, I actually found it to be an enormous advantage.
But since you kind of fell into Psychology Today, not maybe from an interest in psychology, but because it was the best choice for you coming to New York,
If
did you feel like
the job that I had gotten was at like Automotive Weekly or
right,
something,
or
it would
Condé
have been
Nast,
terrible
or,
because
if that
I
was where
wouldn't
you
want to be writing about that. Yeah.
So do you recommend that people, when they're looking for like a first job, maybe out of a program like this, that find something that you can build your career around immediately, or are we stuck if we end up with in a job because it's a good job and because we're writing about something we don't want to maybe build our career around?
Yeah. Well, I think if you have choices in the terms of jobs that you can take, try to take a job that is closest to your genuine interests, what you think you want to write about. And if you can't do that, that's what freelancing can be good for. Then you build your body of work around your freelance articles that are about what you want to write about. And if you don't know what you want to write about, journalism is a great way to find out, because you can try different things. But I really do find that having some kind of specialty, and you want to make it as broad as you can without losing focus, because you don't want to get bored of always writing about the same thing, but having some kind of angle or way into just the enormous variety of things that you could be writing about is really helpful.
Also, too, I think because we pay attention to scientific disciplines, because that's what we may be drawn to, we may kind of buy a little bit too much of the over-specialization of scientific disciplines. Now, you are an expert in learning. Okay,
Right.
That's
right.
different than being, an expert in infant cognitive development in the first 6 months.
Right.
So you're a specialist as far as a journalist is concerned, but yet you are a generalist.
Yes.
And can pretty much still have a license to steal.
Totally. And
Yeah.
and being an expert in learning is something I've become over the last 2 years. I mean,
Right.
it was close enough to what I was doing before to be plausible, but being in the sort of social science area, I guess I would say, is what I've mostly written about, has let me cover lots of different things.
Yeah, but I think your question is
Yeah.
a good jumping off point we can hold for just a sec. So you just said, plausible. So you're plausible now as an expert in learning.
Right, I hope.
If we can just talk for a sec about that.
Uh-huh.
The last 2 years, so you
Yeah.
had this book, a nice success, launched with a lovely review by Jerome Groopman in the New York Times, leads to TED Talks, this, that, and the other thing.
Right.
You're blogging. Tell us just a little bit about this jigsaw that you've created for yourself now.
Yes.
And then I want to take this question.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll say that Origins, when it came out, and I honestly, the thing I cared about most was just that it got printed. Like, I just wanted to see this thing that had tortured me, like, in print. And then it actually got quite a lot of really, as Lee said, really nice reviews, lots of attention, and but again, it didn't sell. It sold much better than my first book, but again, it didn't sell in a way that would allow me to, retire in comfort. Let's say. So
Move out of that cardboard box into a real house.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
And so I very consciously set out, again, I keep trying to make this work, set out to write my third book in a different way. And I very deliberately chose my topic, learning. Partly it was really a subject of great interest to me. And one thing I learned from writing books is that if you're not interested in your topic, it's going to be very hard to spend 18 months or 4 years or whatever thinking about it. So you have to be interested in it. But I also chose it very deliberately because I knew other people were interested in it. And I knew that it had an element of, again, not self-improvement or self-help, but people want to read about it because they want to use the information in their own lives. And I knew that there was I knew from just the other preschool parents, and that there is an endless appetite for information about how children learn, how adults learn, how the brain works. And so I chose it deliberately for that reason. And I decided also that I couldn't go into this writer's cave, which, as Lee said, I tried a few times to write related articles while I was writing Origins, and that always seemed to work better in theory than in reality, because ideally you would kind of get assignments that would pay for your reporting expenses and your trips, and then you could just recycle that material right into your book. And but it never really worked that way, because magazine editors have their own ideas about what they want you to write about. It may not match up precisely with what you need for your chapter. There's rights issues. A lot of magazines you can negotiate this, but don't necessarily want you to just lift a chapter and lift an article and put it right into your chapter. So really that article, I wrote a piece for the New York Times Magazine about fetal pain. There was a debate, an ongoing debate about whether fetuses can feel pain that is germane to the abortion debate. But that didn't make it into the book really in any substantial way.
Well, in any way, shape, or form. I mean, forgive me, in tone, in narrative, characters. I mean,
No.
It could have been in like an entirely separate assignment given to a different reporter. But
Yeah.
You've been
Yeah.
patient.
Hi, I'm just sort of wondering, how do you decide what is a book topic versus what's a longer magazine piece?
Yeah.
I decided I want to write about learning. Like, did you do
Yes.
market research? What did you do?
Well, when I mentioned that I had talked to a bunch of different agents when I was looking for an agent, looking to change agents, and one thing I kept hearing from them was, a lot of books are really just padded out magazine articles. And once they said that, I mean, this is kind of conventional wisdom, but I hadn't really heard about that, and I hadn't really thought about that distinction. And once I heard that, I started seeing that was really the case, that I would look at books and think, well, I know what this book is about already. I've read the excerpt and I kind of get it, and that it was the rare case, or not rare, but that I saw a book and I knew that I'd really need to dig into the whole book to get everything that I could from it, and that was the kind of book that I wanted to write. So I deliberately looked for a big topic.
So what does looking consist of?
Looking, as soon as Origins came out and all the publicity stuff was over, I wanted to get working on a new book, and it was actually a very frustrating few months. Again, it was not really that long, but it felt like a really long time when I was casting about for an idea, and I had to keep reminding myself that I didn't want to rush this, that whatever the idea was, it would come in its own time. And it came out of my personal experience. Oh yes, I now remember what the thing that really crystallized it for me was. I was with my husband looking for preschools for my my youngest son, and went to a bunch of different schools in New Haven where I live, and at each school, and they really differed in their approach and their philosophy, but at each school the director would say, this is how we think children learn best. And I'm immersed every day in the scientific literature of various disciplines, and I just thought, don't we know? Isn't there evidence on this? So then I started looking into it, and I realized that, once again, as with Origins, there was a very large and exciting and dynamic literature on experimental literature on how we learn, but that a lot of it was not making the leap to public awareness. So to me, that was, I'm sorry, I kind of got off the thread of your question, but to me, that's one thing that I would look for is, what's something that's really buzzing, really happening in science that people haven't really heard about? Because you don't want to go the other direction necessarily and think about and say, what are people excited about? Well, let me go look for the science. I mean, sometimes it works that way, but sometimes there might not really be anything happening. And then you can't manufacture that. If you're a science writer, you need real and exciting and thought-provoking science to write about. You know what I mean? So that would be one thing that, for me, would distinguish a book topic from a magazine article, would be that there's not just one guy doing something sort of interesting, which you could get a magazine article out of. There's like a whole community of people, across not just America, but across the globe, who are debating and working on these important questions. If that's happening and nobody's really writing about that, then that's like, that's the gold mine.
And to just add to that question, so, all right, you decided that learning must be really interesting because you're taking your kids to preschool and you're going through the tests.
Yes.
You're staring at yourself in the mirror at midnight and going, oh my God, what have I done? And oh, could I ever? And what made you decide that this was also the kind of interesting, engaging, happy, uplifting thing that people would want to donate like a week or so of their time to reading or to listening about? I mean, what gave you that
sense.
dimension?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned earlier how I'd realized only belatedly after my first book came out that the only people who were really invested in personality tests were those who loved them, and so they weren't about to like or buy my book. With Origins, I realized that I was telling people really important stuff happened before you were born, you know, that you can now do nothing about. How do you like that, you know? And of course, pregnant women who are already bombarded with all these messages about what they're doing and and here I am, and I tried very hard in the book to say, you know, this knowledge can be used in a positive way, but in the end, there were, I think, a lot of pregnant women who were put off by the idea of, oh my God, here's another thing I need to worry about or be anxious about, because what I do during pregnancy matters even more than I thought. Thanks a lot, you know. So the thing that really appealed to me about learning was that it was very much the case that there were things there were techniques that were developed in the laboratory that you could apply right now to help you learn better, understand better, remember better, and that people didn't really know about them and were not doing as well as they could as a result. It actually, I've become a little bit I feel like I'm on a bit of a mission, actually, to share now the stuff that I know about, that I've learned from scientists, that can really help people in their lives right now. And that's you know, different from what I was able to share with people with this.
And yes.
Sorry, I have one more question. About women and your audience of women, and also I think you mentioned in the beginning that you're part of the op-ed project, which is helping women and minorities in writing.
Right.
And I was wondering, because I've noticed that a lot of my favorite writers are men, and but a lot of women are going to journalism school, and I don't know where they're ending up and why they're not writing more, or you know, why I'm not aware of them. But I was wondering what your perspective on that is, and also whether you feel whether you feel more comfortable writing for a female audience. I mean, writing about your pregnancy probably reached a female audience, a larger female audience than it did men, and I'm wondering about women in general in journalism, and if they have the same opportunities as men.
Well, there's a lot of women doing fantastic work in journalism, so I'm not sure why you're not running across them, but certainly a lot of the people I think of as you know, indirect mentors, because I learned from them by reading them, are women. And I think journalism is actually a very woman-friendly occupation. It can be very flexible in terms of having a family. There's not especially now, there's much less of an old boys network. It's really kind of open to all comers who have good ideas. And as for writing about women, this book was almost accidentally about pregnancy. I didn't intend for it to be about women or for women only. And I went to an all-girls school for 12 years, and I think that has made me allergic to anything gender specific. So I really don't think of myself as a woman writer, and I resist all kind of. You asked earlier about being pigeonholed, right? And that is you know, I was always happy to be known as someone who writes about social science or psychology. I never want to be known as a woman writer or someone who writes for women. And I was actually careful not to write too much for women's magazines, because you can get pigeonholed that way, because women's magazines, not totally unfairly, are seen as a certain genre that is not, in some ways, not as serious as other places. So I'm sure that played a role in choosing my next subject too. I didn't want to stay in a realm of writing that could be construed as being for women or only about women.
But you also chose a fundamentally different approach to the whole process itself. You didn't just sort of come out of the writer's cave. I mean, you have turned this into a public process.
Right.
You have not just turned it into a public process. You are essentially writing chunks of your book. But I mean, you've got 3 different blogs going. You're an active. I can never find the right verb
Tweeter,
for one who
Facebooker,
tweets.
yeah,
you know,
yeah.
Tweeter just
Twitter.
doesn't sound seemly. I don't know. Yeah, but at any rate, I mean, you are
Yeah.
a study in the distractions of, like, you know, modern writing and journalism. I mean, this
Yeah.
is all stuff designed to interfere with you getting any
Yeah,
work done.
yeah.
And yet you're harnessing it all. You are doing this why? I mean, to build an appetite for the book before the book exists, to keep you from writing the book? I mean, what's
Hopefully
going on
not.
here?
Well, you know, the book publishing industry has changed a lot over the last however many years, and has is suffering from a crisis that no one really knows how to solve. So I think it's really, including very much editors and publishing houses themselves, they're as clueless or more clueless than anybody else in terms of how to sell books. So it's really on, I came to realize that it's really on, and that doesn't include my own editor. This is being videotaped, right? My own editor and publishing house is totally on top of it. But I guess I mean that the media landscape has shifted so much, and there are so many other forms of entertainment competing for people's attention these days, that asking them to buy a book for $25 and sit down for a week, you know, spend an hour a night a week for a week or more reading it, is a lot to ask, and a lot of people are not doing it. And some people have, you know, a lot of writers I know, and I fell in this camp until fairly recently. You know, writers hate to write for free. That was kind of
Indeed.
like an article of, like, the journalistic faith is that you don't write for free. And yet, if you take your advance and, you know, spend 2 years writing a book, you may find, and not doing all this other stuff, you may find that when the book comes out, you've got a very steep hill to climb in terms of making people aware of your book, finding readers who will pay that $25 for your book. And even when you get a lot of traditional, conventional media coverage, as both of my books did, you may find that you don't get a corresponding number of readers. So I was really determined to figure this out. And I don't know if I have. Obviously, I haven't finished my book yet. But I was reluctantly but determinedly drawn into doing things differently. And I have to say, it's been much more fruitful and much more satisfying and helpful than I would have imagined. I really did it kind of kicking and screaming.
Unpack it
Yeah,
for us.
yeah. So, well, I should say, I don't know how to talk about it without talking about a good friend of mine who really led the way. She really is my guru.
That is?
So her name is Gretchen Rubin, and she wrote a very successful book called The Happiness Project. And Gretchen had written she had written some books before, including a biography of Winston Churchill that sold very well, and then a biography of JFK, which did not sell well. And she's a Yale Law School trained, brilliant person, and she just decided to sort of figure out how this new economy of book writing and selling worked. And so with the Happiness Project, she chose, I think, what has to be the most widely, I mean, who doesn't want to be happy? So she chose the most widely appealing topic imaginable. She started, years before the book came out, she started blogging daily about happiness, you know, looking into all kinds of perspectives on happiness, psychology studies, sociology, you know, just historical writings on happiness, and just delivering a lot of really smart but widely appealing information to people. And she tweeted, I think her rule was like 3 to 5 times a day she was tweeting. This was before, I feel like Twitter started out, at least my awareness of it was like people tweeting what they had for breakfast and what was like, you know, here I am in the line at the supermarket or something. And as I've become more aware of Twitter, I've realized that it can be used in so many more useful, concretely useful and substantial ways. But that was my impression of Twitter, was like this big waste of time. Same with Facebook. So, and Gretchen showed me that these things could be tools for sharing information with people, and that would start to build a base of readers and fans long before your book ever came out. And I'll tell you what my other objection, part of it was, this is a waste of time. The other part was, why would anyone buy a book when you've been putting you know, all your material out there for free? Like, what kind of model is this, you know? But
as newspapers have found to their regret,
right,
if you give it away, they don't want to buy it. Yeah.
Right. But I've found, first of all, that you can write pieces of, you can use venues like blogs and online columns as ways to explore ideas. You get feedback from people. You often are contacted by people, scientists, or I've met and encountered so many interesting people just from putting stuff out there. It's kind of like a magnet that draws in new sources, new avenues for your research. So it's very generative in that way. But also, if you choose a project where the real value is in the synthesis of the ideas that you're exploring, and these sort of, you know, if you think of them as sort of like tentacles that are reaching out, but really the value that you ultimately are going to give to your readers is in the synthesis of these ideas and how you pull them together. This is my hope anyway, that people who've read a column here, or maybe even are a regular follower of your blog, when your book comes out, their appetite will have just been whetted for what you write about and what you do, and they're familiar with you as a guide to this particular area, and they want to know how you put it all together. And let's face it, I mean, even if you have a really favorite writer and they've written 5 different articles in different places, that's not the same as having all of what they think on a topic collected in a book, you know. So it certainly worked that way for Gretchen Rubin. She wrote a lot of her book over the course of blogging, but you know, it was the #1 New York Times bestseller for for more than a year. So people were willing and in fact eager to buy her book, even though, I don't want to say even though, because they'd been reading her blog.
The because part is what's interesting.
Yeah.
So you have now 3 blogs.
So well, this is
where do you find time for this
is
stuff?
another.
This is what I want to know. That's
yeah. Well, they're weekly blogs.
Okay.
This is another arm of my strategy that I don't know if it's going to work, but I do still have a resistance to writing for free. So I thought, well, if I'm going to have a website with a blog where I'm sharing my thoughts about learning, I might as well extend the reach of that. You know, who's going to go to my blog? Right now, not that many people know about me, or, you know, without, if you can piggyback on the big audiences that a place like Time.com has, or Mindshift is a place that I write for that is a blog of NPR. And I consciously sat down and thought, well, who would my readers be? What would they read? You know, and like at the NPR listener, I think that might be someone who would ideally read my book. I want to not just write about children and learning, so let me explore the business and corporate aspects of learning through this blog on Forbes.com. And then Time, of course, you know, is just this great slice of American readers. So I get paid for these blogs, for writing these blogs.
You paid a lot?
Yeah, I don't get paid a lot.
No.
But I think I take the writing more seriously because I get paid. I think my editor takes the writing more seriously because I get paid. And you know, it means that I make a few $1,000s each month by blogging, which is not as much as I would make if I, say, wrote a big, long feature article, like that New York Times Magazine article, but those take an enormous amount of time and effort, much more than, I've learned to write these online columns very fast, and I can really easily pluck out something I'm curious about and want to explore in a way that, you know, a magazine piece
And
is
just as a
much more
practical matter,
involved.
how do you work out this sort of legal, who owns what
Yeah.
stuff? I mean, do you, I'm not clear on this. I mean,
Yeah.
have you, the problem with the long magazine article
Yeah.
is it goes in a direction you're not interested in because it's driven by the editor's sense, but also you don't own it.
Right.
And if you're going to reuse it for a book, it gets complicated. Well, with these 3 different blogs, I mean,
Right.
have you not just multiplied that problem by 3?
Well, interestingly, this, you know, magazines are adopting this new model too, because Forbes, the way they check, you have to approach them and they have to kind of approve you and check you out and say, okay, you're somebody we think is respectable. We want to have you contribute, but then they give you a password to their WordPress platform. No, I guess somebody reads it before it goes up. This is how Huffington Post works also, that once you contribute there once, you get a password, and then you are free to post as often as you want about whatever you want. So in that case, everybody who is a blogger for Forbes.com owns everything that they, you know, they don't give you a lot in terms of editing or whatever, but they don't take a lot either. In the case of the Mindshift blog and the Time.com blog columns, they wrote up I asked that they write up a special contract for me, and I showed that to my agent, who looked it over and said, okay, this gives you rights to whatever you write. And the Time.com blog was the first one that I arranged. I've been writing it since the fall, and I did it with the understanding that it would be kind of branded with the title of my book and a picture of me, and so it doesn't blend
okay.
into, you know, the generic Time coverage. It's a branded platform, you know.
And they're happy
again,
with that?
I think that's how they get people to write a weekly column for $250 a pop, you know, which is what they pay me.
Okay.
I think so also, because people also, this is how it works now, that you kind of, you don't just say, I'm going to go read Time. You say, I'm going to go read what Joe Klein has to say about politics in this week's Time, or I'm going to go read Joel Stein. And so actually, if you're someone who has a readership and an audience, that only benefits the magazine. So it is a little bit like you're no longer a cog in a big magazine's machine. You are your own. It's a little bit like having a small business, I would say. Like you have to be very entrepreneurial, I would say.
Yeah.
Annie, can I follow up?
Yeah.
No, please.
So what you're saying, that last point that you made, is so true. The whole relationship between, you know, the author and the publisher is fundamentally shifted. When relatively little money changes hands, the obligations change too. It's
Yes.
your content and your brand, and
Yes.
you have much more sway. What I hear people say who are authors and who are reluctant to take the plunge the way that you have, that, you know, take the blogging plunge the way that you have, I hear them say three things, and one of them you already addressed, which is the question of, you know, will they still be interested in my stuff if I in reading my stuff if I put it online?
Right.
I think you're right about that. I think that's probably the least of the concerns. But there are 2 other ones that I think are more legit. And one is this question of you know, putting stuff out in the public domain that then other reporters, you know, take. So from a competitive point of view, if you're trying to hold stuff back for a book, I know that would make me very nervous.
Yeah.
And the second thing that would make me really nervous is that, you know, when you just do some reporting, but you don't really go deep, you know, you often think you know the story, but then the story fundamentally changes after you talk to 3 more people or read 5 more journal articles, and so I would really worry about putting errors out there or contradicting myself, and sort of making myself look kind of foolish by saying one thing online and then coming back in the book and saying, and again, I think there's something sort of very sweetly nostalgic about those kinds of concerns in a digital world where the idea is you just put it out there and you can fix it later. But for somebody like me, I would be worried about those 2 things, and I wonder if you worry about them and how you deal with them, either the contradiction problem or the competition problem.
Yeah. No, those are both really good questions. So to address the second one first, I don't believe that online journalism should have a different standard from print journalism, traditional journalism, in terms of errors or, I think we need to be every bit as careful and fact check our own stuff, and, even more so because we're often doing it on the fly and fast. But in terms of another piece of that, whether we can allow our thinking to evolve in public, I think that's okay. I'm very much learning as I go about this subject that I've chosen to write about, and I see my pieces as an exploration that I'm bringing the reader along for, rather than, the traditional model would be like, okay, here's my book and here's my final statement on what my topic is, and I am temperamentally. I'm very much a perfectionist, and I would like to have every I dotted and T crossed before I put things out there. I had to kind of force myself to be a bit more experimental, and actually having so many deadlines helps with that, because sometimes you just gotta, I used to hang on to things and agonize over them, and there's no time for that. And that's actually a very good lesson if you're someone who maybe overwrites or overthinks. And then to address your first question, Dan, I think you're absolutely right that there are some books for which this model is not suited at all. If you're working on an investigative piece where you could blow your cover with sources, or you could be just giving away your scoop to other competitors, I think that's absolutely. This doesn't work at all. But I would also say that we journalists, if we want to have a viable book writing career, may have to choose our topics with this model in mind, to say, does this topic lend itself to sharing pieces of it as I go and building a platform and building a readership? If it doesn't, maybe it's not. Maybe it's better suited for a magazine article, or maybe I'll choose a different book topic because this isn't a going enterprise. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and there's also, if I could just chime in for a sec, there's a quality that you can achieve of a conversation on a topic with readers that can be hugely valuable as an instructional learning thing for the reporter or writer, him or herself, but also then brings the reader in and empowers the reader and gives the reader a stake in the conversation.
Yes.
And I do think that a number of really large newspapers, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, have all made a major mistake in how they handled comments, for instance, because they have, for whatever reasons, I assume each institution has a different one, but the effect and the mechanism is the same across the board. They do not allow the reporter-reader conversation. Instead, what you get is a blind comment section, and it becomes like a bulletin board for the most sort of mindless, vituperative trolling.
Yeah.
And if anything, it drives people away.
Yes.
Now, I don't know if that's because reporters are afraid of readers, which many of them are.
Yeah.
Surprisingly, don't like talking to readers. Readers make them uncomfortable because what do you know? They challenge what they've written.
Yeah.
But of course, being challenged and responding to a challenge, and then that's sort of like what a certain kind of blog, what a certain kind of online encounter is enabling and what
Yes.
it's about, and it's
Yes.
a wonderful
Yes.
thing, and it diffuses certain kinds of things.
Yes. And I will say that I almost never read the comment section of my online articles because they're either totally uninformed and only vaguely related to what I've written,
Yeah, yeah.
or just nasty screeds or whatever. But the Twitter and
Mhm.
Facebook conversations about my articles have been, I probably was one of those reporters who was afraid of readers, who
Mhm.
just like to kind of put it out there and then run away.
Yeah, yeah.
But now people actually, you know, there's a side of the internet that is so vicious and mean, but my interactions since I started putting this stuff out there have by and large been so positive and so encouraging that when I think about writing this book, part of the reason that it took me 4 years is that it was a very lonely and isolating process, and I now feel I feel completely differently about writing this book. That it is actually buoyed by this ongoing conversation, in which a lot of very well-informed and you know, smarter than me in lots of areas, people are participating and helping me. I know that sounds really Pollyanna-ish, but it actually has been my experience, especially on Twitter. There's just a really, you know, you tweet a lot. I'm sure you hear from readers about who liked your articles. It's just, it's kind of, you know, it's kind of nice.
Yeah, no, I actually find it as a medium,
Yeah.
if that's what it is.
Yeah.
It's got much more of a kind of positive
Yeah.
energy to it than, say, the comment sections of our website, which a journal website, which is in no way, shape, or form different, I think, in form and arrangement than any other newspaper website, and it makes you want to go home and put your head in the refrigerator. You know, I mean, it's
Right.
it.
Yeah.
And it is sort of in a most kind of awful way disconnected from anything that you wrote
Right.
in your article. And paywalls, which of course are now coming back, make this even more dramatic because it doesn't matter to a commenter to have actually read past the first 30 words of your story. So it just gives them a place to jump off with their nastiness. Sir.
Hi, I wanted to ask a question about something you'd mentioned about, you know, blogging and tweeting and kind of building a brand for yourself in advance of your upcoming book. I'm just wondering how the proliferation of aggregate sites and aggregation has affected that at all.
Affected it in what sense?
Just in the sense of, you know, people gleaning information from you and borrowing it to, you know, paste into a column or a piece that they're
Interesting.
writing. I'm just finding aggregation seems to be more and more the norm in journalism these days.
Yeah. Well, I visited a friend of mine who's an editor at Huffington Post a few weeks ago, and I was flabbergasted by, you know, the building itself is just like football field-sized rooms filled with 20-somethings kind of tapping away. And I thought, oh my God, this is when I started in journalism. You started as an editorial assistant. And that was the entry-level job. And as I said, it didn't. In some ways, didn't have a lot to argue for it, but you were kind of learning a craft. And what are young people who start out as aggregators learning? I don't know, but you know, I haven't really had an issue with people lifting material from me. In part because I'm actually not trying to write about whatever the latest, you know. Sometimes what I write about is informed by the news, but it's in a way I'm trying to dig up stuff that people haven't seen and share it, and put my own stamp on it. And I just haven't. I guess it's not generic enough to kind of be lifted and dropped into somebody else's article. And also, I think we need to think about these days. As long as I would almost say, as long as it has your name attached, you know, you kind of want it to be as many places as possible. And we were just talking about this before the session, that if the goal used to be exclusivity, you know, like I write for Vogue magazine or the New York Times, or, you know, that's where the cachet came from, and that's where the prestige came from. Now the goal might be ubiquity. You just want to be everywhere. You we can mourn the passing of that era where exclusivity was prized, but I don't think it's coming back.
It does also, your point about aggregation is right on, and I'm of the, it's theft school, But it's easier and more traditional to steal a fact. Newspapers have been complaining about radio people ripping readings since the 1940s. And in one way, what this highlights is the importance of voice and the importance of synthesis. And when you aggregate that, part of what you want to aggregate is the identity of the voice. So there it works for you.
Yeah, I almost.
Between aggregation
Sir, would you use the microphone?
I almost always find that people link back, and
That's the other
and
thing.
that's fine.
Yeah, well,
if they do that, then.
There's an evolving etiquette.
What I was going to say was it's pretty important to make a distinction between aggregators who add value and aggregators who don't, right? Everyone, including all of you who are studying in this program and other programs here, should learn the skill of aggregation plus. Aggregation plus is what everyone needs to learn to do, which is to borrow other people's work and credit it appropriately, but then add your own take and add your own value and your own voice and link back appropriately and do all the things that ethical journalists should do. I'm becoming convinced that that's a net plus, that is a legitimate form of journalistic expression that actually helps everyone if it's done to a proper standard, which it often isn't.
Right.
That's a good thing, and it's something that we should stop resisting. What we should resist are people who the sum total of their work is simply summarizing and linking and summarizing and linking and summarizing and linking, or simply, even worse, summarizing without linking. That's a problem.
Well, and it gets immediately into this thorny intellectual property, who gets paid for what thing. As long as people are aggregating and sharing and tweeting to people they know, it's not any different than tearing something out of a magazine and handing it to a friend of yours. It spreads the information, it spreads the word further. But when someone's got like a multi-million-dollar business model that they're getting like big IPO money for, and the person who's being aggregated isn't getting a piece of that, then it's not a friendly enterprise. It's a ripoff. There's a tension there, and it is certainly the case that large aggregators. The 10 largest news sites, only 3 of them are what you or I or most people in this room would consider news organizations. They are things like Yahoo News and whatever, which don't do anything except put a thumbprint on it as it goes by. They're making a lot of money on this, and we do this for a living. Yes, we should do some lost leader pro bono blogging stuff to build this, that, and the other thing, but there's a difference between being a journalist as a profession and being a hobbyist, and both are fine, but they're different, and one of them has to do with paying bills. So, I get cranky about aggregation at a certain point. So.
Yeah, we're still finding where that murky line that I call adding value. My idea of what legitimate adding value is, might be different from Yahoo's. Yahoo thinks they're adding value simply by linking back, that somehow that's enough. I don't think that's quite enough.
What about a site like Lifehacker or something where they're collecting the best of what they see on the web and linking back? When the Lifehacker's picked up, or the browser or something has picked up my things occasionally, and I thought, great, that's a whole new audience.
Yeah, well, at least they do link back. And it's intelligent curation.
Right.
I don't know. We're all still really figuring this out. I just think that all of us who are content providers feel like we want, if people are going to use our content, we want 2 things. We want full credit, and we want them to add something to the conversation too. At least we'd prefer it.
Yeah. But if I may say, to you, that as content providers, and I'm not sure I like thinking of myself that way. It sounds like making cheese, but but cheese is good, you know. We're all better off, you know, riding the horse as it gallops off in a strange new direction, which is what you were doing, I think, than kind of holding back and saying, well, you know, it doesn't quite suit how I think it ought to be. It doesn't really. I mean, we are just surrounded by possibilities and new directions, and nobody has any idea how it's going to fall out, except that we all know that people are interested in this stuff, you know, and it's our challenge to get it out to them, and then in a form that they may or may not feel like giving us something back, you know.
Right.
And that's actually very exciting, as it is equally terrifying.
It is. It is. Are you wrapping up? I was going to add
No,
one more
please,
thing. No,
please.
okay, which was just that one other way that writers are going to make a living, I think, is by giving readers something that they can't get on the screen, which is a live performance or the live presence of the author. And not book readings. I don't think those are kind of a dying form as well. But there are a lot of opportunities for in speaking for writers. And a lot of writers I know make most of their money that way. And that's most of their, you know, their income that way. And that's another area where it kind of has to start. If you want to do that, you kind of have to start with your topic. You know, not every topic is going to lend itself to the speaking circuit, but that can be a way that your writing reaches more people, and that can support your writing, so that you can continue to write.
And like the ultimate resume piece for that speaking circuit, of course, is a TED Talk, which is out there like being viewed by everybody all over the place and translated into languages and whatever.
Right.
How did you land a
Right.
spot on the TED stage?
Well, I'm embarrassed to say that when the TED people reached out to me, I hadn't heard of TED. So when I heard from them, then I went to the TED website and saw what incredible people they have giving talks, and I watched a few of them and was kind of blown away at how complex and substantive 18 minutes of talking can be. That's how long the talks usually are.
That's a long TED Talk.
That's
They do
some
the
of them are
3-minute
short,
ones.
3 minutes.
Yeah, it's amazing what you can say in 3 minutes.
In 3 minutes, yeah. And what's that?
Mine?
Oh.
Yeah, it gave me 18, 19 minutes, yeah. Yeah.
So, but most of what I was aware of when they asked me was that they were offering to fly me to Scotland for free, because it was the
That's nice too.
TED Global Conference, which
Yeah.
was the regular one is in Long Beach, California, and then they have one in Scotland. And as the mother of 2 young children, a flight by myself and a week in a hotel in Scotland sounded like a no-brainer. So. But then I realized what a big deal it is in terms of they send you this thing in the mail. This it looks like a tombstone that's engraved with the words "the TED Commandments," and they tell you it's like 10. You got one of these, right? Like 10 guidelines for what you should and shouldn't do. And I was like, oh God, what have I gotten myself into? And then there's the terrifying fact that you're up on a stage in front of all these people. Being videotaped, and you have to talk for 18 minutes. It ended up being a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun, and it reaches so many people. It's amazing. But I think it helped that I went into it not really even aware of what it was all
It's
about.
amazing discipline, but now I'm sort of curious because you brought this up.
Yeah.
So do you do a lot of speaking now? Do you?
I'm starting to. And again, this is not something I ever wanted to do or thought I was suited to, but figured I better get better at it. So I have been working with a speaking coach and just taking as many opportunities. Actually, I did a lot of speaking following Origins. There, I got a lot of invitations to speak, and those were paid. They were through my speakers agency that's affiliated with my publisher. But especially when I started out writing about and thinking about learning, I sought out and accepted invitations to speak about learning for free, just because I wanted to practice out my ideas and get better at speaking. And again, it's kind of like plunging into the whole social media world. It's been enormously rewarding and gratifying in a way that I hadn't anticipated. First of all, it gets easier the more you do it, the more comfortable you feel, and also you get all this feedback from people, and people come up to you afterwards and say, do you know about this person's work, or you know? And I had the experience after my first 2 books came out where people would come up to me after the book came out and they'd say, oh, I wondered if you knew about so and so, because or they would bring up an idea and I'd think, oh, I wish I'd thought about that, now that it's in print. And so now it's a much more dynamic and flexible kind of way of writing a book where I'll be honest, it's kind of head spinning because you have a lot to manage, and it's not like going into your cave and focusing on one thing, but I think it's a juggling act that maybe more and more of us will be doing.
Well, and now I will wrap it up. If it's a juggling act that more and more of us will be doing, it's a juggling act that you're showing us how to perform. And you've shared a lot of it with us tonight, and I thank you very much for that.
Oh,
really
thank
and truly.
you. Thank you. This is really fun.